Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. A quick reminder, if you have any questions, or indeed if you can see me talking but you can't hear me, please do put a message in the message box and your questions that you might have for the speakers as well, and we'd be delighted to take those. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I feel incredibly lucky to be joined by Fiona and Volker, and I'm going to introduce them or ask them to introduce themselves in just a second. So my name's Alice Henchley. I'm the Communications Director here at Springer Nature. And we obviously have a particularly big interest in this topic today because we've published a lot of the relevant research that's being widely discussed and also leveraged during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we are delighted that we work very closely with the Science Media Centres, and obviously they've played a huge role in everything that's been happening around the pandemic and communicating the science. So I'm going to ask them, my colleagues, to introduce themselves. Fiona, can I hand over to you, please?
Okay, yes, thank you. So I'm Fiona Fox and I'm the founding director of the Science Media Centre in the UK. We were set up in 2002, so we're 20 next year. And we were set up in the wake of major scientific controversies that were, in the view of the scientific community, poorly reported by the news media, and that was MMR and GM crops. We have a focus, we've always maintained quite a clear focus on the news media. So we don't actually help the wonderful news journalists on nature and science and new scientists. We focus on the mass media, the news that the majority of the non-sciencey public access. And we also have a focus on the kind of contested scientific claims, the science controversies. What do we do? Very briefly, we have 4 quick services. So a rapid reaction to breaking news. So a story breaks and we go to a database of 3,000 very good scientists and get their reactions to the story that's breaking. Secondly, we go to the same database and gather third-party scientists on new scientific findings. In the old days, that used to be under embargo for peer-reviewed journals. During COVID, it was obviously a lot of that was on preprint, so helping the journalists see the science in context and whether there's significant findings or not. We run press conferences. During COVID, we ran 200 press conferences, which either bring the research, so it's the authors of the studies talking to the science and health journalists and explaining it and answering their questions, or the kind of backgrounders on areas of science that we think are poorly understood. And then we're a basic press office as well that answer journalists' questions. So throughout COVID, we were getting 30, 40 journalists a day saying, I need to ask immunologists if they can explain this aspect of COVID, and we will connect them with the best immunologists. So I think that's us.
Yeah, so a quiet 18 months then, Fiona.
Yes.
Brilliant. Volker, can you tell us a little bit about you and your organization, please?
Yeah, so I'm a science journalist by training, and I had the honor working closely with Fiona in setting up the German SMC, and they helped incredibly lot in setting up us, and many of the products Fiona mentioned, we kind of doing the same. And so I may focus on the difference. So when the pandemic struck, we also reorganized quite a lot. So we did these virtual press briefings like you did, not 200, over 200, but over 70. And they were quite successful. So many journalists were really curious to talk to the real experts, having the opportunity to ask questions. And at certain times when there was an overwhelming interest in journalism and in any expertise available in these high uncertain times. So that was a very success story for us. And we were a trusted source. So many journalists came. There were up to 150, 160 people coming to these press briefings. But we also did some other things. For example, directly from the beginning, we tried to organize a kind of commented publication list. So trying to organize this flood of publications a little bit and commenting for colleagues to find the good papers fast. And that was very successful too. So people in science departments liked it a lot. And we also, and that is maybe a little difference between the UK SMC, we have a lab where we have a lot of support from informatics and data science guys. And we also put out kind of a corona report ourselves for the journalists to figure out what the numbers mean and what all these differences in the numbers mean. And that was also quite successful with data journalists, so they could get more data-based informations. And of course, the interpretations, how to not read the numbers. because there are a lot of mistakes being made, even now, the newspapers, what all these numbers mean. So, and for us as a young organization, so we are online since 5 years now, and we learned a lot during the pandemic, interaction with experts, interaction with journalists, and we had a very good time, but also very stressful time. So we are a little bit exhausted at the moment because the life science medical team is just 3 people, so that many people in this issue. And I'm looking forward to the debate. So it was a very interesting time. And the interesting question is, how will science journalism and the journalism about science be different after the pandemic? That's a very interesting question that we are thinking about it a lot. And one issue is, of course, I think in this huge information overload with the pandemic, we really didn't report about some other major scientific developments. And that is maybe a problem. And we have to work on that. So some fields advanced during the pandemic quite fast, and the public didn't get to know a lot of it. And that is a problem I think we have to address in the future also.
Wow, Volker, you've opened up about 1 million questions in the space of a couple of minutes. That is brilliant. Let's start by talking about the beginning of the pandemic. So, you know, cast our minds back to, I think really for most of us, it was January of last year when we really realized that this was going to hit. And, you know, within Nature, and some of the other places, we were handling these very early papers, like the first sequencing of the virus, and we knew that we had to move incredibly quickly, and we started to see scientists reviewing very fast, papers being submitted very quickly, responses coming in at a completely different speed for us. So that was an interesting point where we knew that the press office was also going to have to accelerate everything that we did as well. What did it feel like when you had those early stages? When did you first become aware of this, and what changes were you making? Fiona, should we start with you?
So I think, became aware of it kind of early January, and we have a kind of media monitoring role where we do look at emerging issues, and this was only global correspondence, not UK science correspondence. It was called then the Wuhan virus, if you remember. So these were reports emerging, and we didn't have many scientists at that stage alerting us to it. So we had it on kind of media monitoring watch. And a couple of our colleagues were saying, are we ready to do a briefing? And then I think it was mid-January where some of the scientists on our database were like people like Jeremy Farrar, who we live in the Wellcome collection. He runs the Wellcome Trust and is a global infectious diseases expert, were contacting us to say they were worried about this one in a way that they don't normally. So we became aware, I think, mid-January that we needed to do something, and we had our first briefing, I'm not sure what date, but in January, and that was a briefing that wasn't about any new study or new findings or anything like that. It was 4 or 5 leading experts, so the chair of NERVTAC, Peter Horby, Jeremy Farrar, and others, just saying what they knew and what they didn't know. David Heyman, who is very well known as a WHO expert for many years. So I think we just felt like this is growing, and we need the science and health journalists to get as much information about what we know as we can, and that we saw that as our job.
Volker, how about you?
Yeah, it was actually funny because I was on vacation and I got an email on 5th January from a colleague from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, science editor, and he asked me, she had a report from China, from her correspondent from China, that there was an unknown epidemic of pneumonia rising, and she asked me whether I would have experts to comment on that, because she felt that this may be blown out of proportions. And she wanted us to be cautious and say, well, what is going to happen? And I didn't realize at the time. So I immediately put our center on alert. And on, I think, 19 January, we had the first fact sheet and then sent it out to our 1,500 journalists. That was just one day before this transmission story came out, so that this virus was not just infectious like SARS and MERS for the people closely with one person, but could also transmit easily between persons. And that was basically the major breaking news. And then we had our first press briefing on 14th February. And I still remember that briefing quite well. It was in Berlin, still live at the time before the first German cases came to Germany. And there was Christian Drosten and Clemens Wendner, both famous physicians and virologists in Germany, And there had these first signs that people who came to Germany were not as ill as we heard from China. So we had this kind of problem, how dangerous is this virus now? And with hindsight, we know now we had these younger persons first infected and not the older ones. And therefore we kind of, in the beginning, missed out on the real EFR of that virus in Germany. So that was quite interesting. So it took a little bit to sink in that this is very serious virus and not just one minor issue. And then we had these big fights about what the EFR really is and how dangerous this virus is. Is it like a flu or is it more like a flu? And all these debates. And it became very political very early on, even before the first lockdown. And we were always trying to get the best guys out there and stay on track and had lots of discussions. And I think we reorganized completely in this pandemic with these publication lists, with the virtual press briefings, with lots of experts' comments on all sorts of stories. And we were really rewarded for doing this in the German press. And even the people who became skeptical of Science Media Center agenda setting issues beforehand said, well, you were really, really helpful in helping us report on this the biggest story ever. I mean, this is a world event, of course.
So how were you reorganizing, Volker? What did that mean? And were you working with different people as a result?
Yeah, first of all, we had to reorganize and say, well, let's at least 3 people are just working on the pandemic stuff and always and check all the sources and the new publications, so preprint servers, all the journals, trying to find experts on all new aspects which were coming up, and first virologists, epidemiologists, but then global experts, everybody. And we had to expand our expert database quite fast to have more experts on ground. And also to keep them talking to the press, because at certain points in Germany, at least, it became so political that very important and very good scientists refused to talk to the public anymore. And at least we could keep them in the SMC and say, well, here's a kind of a protected space. If you talk to us, we will help all the journalists out there, and you don't have to be on the phone all day. That helped a little bit, but of course, and then we had these 3 people, and then we had a data scientist and all the lab helping with all these programming stuff in the background, and also the whole organization of the products we had to put out. And it was an incredible amount of work. And but still, we learned a lot of lessons how we can be faster, better, and still have quality control. And that is also a good thing, that you can be a little bit faster and still doing good stuff. So. But it's, of course, very exhausting, and we couldn't do it now forever in this speed. We would have more resources to kind of have maybe a few more people working on these kind of issues. Yeah.
Fiona, did you find the same kind of processes needed to change, and you were kind of moving people around?
Yeah, so all of that sounds incredibly familiar, and I think all the global SMCs were experiencing fairly similar things, especially in the countries which were badly affected. Before I just answer that, I just want to make a point that Volker reminded me about the early thinking in the centre, because we were set up in a way to stop scare stories. And as Volker mentioned, some people thought this was a scare story. And actually, we've sat in our office. There's going to be a big official inquiry in the UK into what went wrong. And we've sat in our office and thought, did we get anything wrong? And one of my colleagues was saying, do you remember those early modelling reports that were coming out with big, scary numbers, hundreds of thousands could be affected? And we sent emails with our stock advice to modellers: do not emphasise the big figures. Make sure that journalists know that the most likely scenario is in the middle or towards the smaller figures. And now we're thinking, oh my God, will we be accused? These emails will be found and we'll be accused of playing it down. But that's because we were really, really in our DNA. We tried to stop scientists hyping or overclaiming, and that being what the media use. In fact, though, we did know, because of these calls from scientists, and I actually wrote a blog in early February aimed at those people who are on the phone to me saying, look at this, killer virus on the front page of the tabloids, the SMC should be doing something about this. And I wrote a blog to answer them, which is to say there's a difference between alarmism and alarm. And on this one, there is genuine alarm from people who are global experts who've lived through Ebola, SARS and MERS, and they're saying this is different. So I just wanted to make that point. So I think if it does come up in the inquiry, I think we did have a sense and we did get it right. Everything that Volker has said in terms of, yeah, we have 5 press officers in the team. This is the only time in 20 years that they've all worked on one story. There was no other story for us. This was the only one we were working on. The whole speed of it. We actually, of course, as we were moving into lockdown and away from the office, we migrated the database, if you like, into lists of COVID experts. We knew that when we were at home, we wouldn't need all of those other, you know, cloning scientists or climate change. So we produced lists which made it easier for us to press a button and get the immunologist, press another button and get the public health experts, and also dividing that. Usually there'll be 2 or 3 keywords, but actually we wanted to make sure that we were getting the right experts for the right questions. And scientists do step out of their lane. They do that, and you know, they felt a responsibility to do lots of media work. We actually didn't want to encourage that, so we were making sure that these lists were separated into different groupings, so that the behavioural scientists weren't answering questions about, is this airborne or whatever. So yeah, lots of ways. And of course, preprint, Alice, I'm sure you want to talk about this, but I do remember, and again, I'm not as good as Volker at remembering which moment this was at. We were still in the office, so it's probably February. My colleagues saw a preprint which was making quite scary claims about prevalence, so infection numbers. It was a preprint, and at that time, our advice to communication staff in universities is don't publicize a preprint, don't press release them. They're wonderful things, but we shouldn't press release it until it's a published paper. And so I left the office saying to my colleague, let's not get comments, because if we get third-party comments on that, then we're treating it as if it's a published paper. It was a Friday. The next morning, it was absolutely everywhere. And actually, I then went to get comments on one of the authors of the paper. The preprint was on my list of people I was asking comments for, and came back and said, we've got a fact wrong. And he said, oh, we've tweeted it out, everybody will know. None of the journalists knew, they hadn't seen his tweet. And so I ended up both gathering third-party comments on a preprint and sending the author's corrections to the journalists. So we knew from that day that we were going to have to do media work on preprints. Now, of course, our media work isn't writing press releases and publicising them, it is gathering third-party comments. And I remembered a discussion at our board meeting a few years ago where we were adamant, you know, nobody should press release preprints. And they were saying, well, okay, Fiona, but if they do, the Science Media Centre could actually come into their own a bit here, because it'll be even more urgent if it's immediate release, no lovely embargo, no 2 or 3 days to get third-party experts, to get them quickly. And Volker's point there about acting at speed, but still acting good. And we always assumed that you wouldn't get as high quality third-party comments if you were asking for them instantly. But actually, I think this 18 months shows that we were able, very, very good scientists who were focused on this, able to look at a preprint and give us some cautious comments about it. So
I mean, I think preprints is huge, and we're going to talk about it a lot. And Volker, I know you're going to have a lot to say on this. I think the couple of things that I would like to unpack quickly are, I think there's a misconception that that publishers hate preprints and don't agree with them, when actually publishers have been kind of involved in the broader landscape for a really long time. And you know, we've advocated for the use of preprints very proactively since before the pandemic, and also sort of encouraged and expected it as part of the scientific process for decades. We truly believe preprints have this incredibly important role in pushing science forward in the same way that scientific conferences do. But your point, Fiona, here about actually are these documents, are these manuscripts in a suitable position to communicate to the general public is a really important one. And, you know, we discussed this a lot during the pandemic. Do we completely lift any embargo rules? Do we expect people will be communicating preprints freely? And certainly that did happen in some cases. And there were some cases where it was particularly, for example, a piece of research or data that was informing a government policy and was being fed directly in. That made a huge amount of sense. What we weren't very keen on is, and we remain this, is for papers that don't have a very immediate public health impacts being promoted at a point when they haven't been verified. And I think for us, what was really clear, or has been clear, is that you get some very insightful comments from scientists at any point that you ask them for their opinion, but it's not a peer review. And the peer review process really, although it's flawed, it's not perfect, it is better than anything else we've got. So what was also interesting with us, with scientists, is we had a few cases scientists were keen to promote their preprints, and then actually came back and said, actually, no, we don't want to, because we're seeing what's coming through on the peer review, and we want to, there's more work we need to do on this before it's a more public facing document. So it was an interesting process for us, which sort of reinforced our general position on preprints, but also made us reevaluate cases as sort of outliers where we would expect exceptions and we would support exceptions as well. But Volker, how was your experience with preprints?
Yeah, I think Fiona will remember that when we met in London, we were a little bit more open to preprints, not by just saying we need to have third-party comments on any preprint, but what we were looking into technical possibilities to detect certain preprints who are either a potential major breakthrough, so being first and then get later to peer review could be a signal for us to get third-party comments and then send them out on any point when it's taking up in the press. So not just press releasing and commenting on any preprint, of course not, but spotting interesting preprints through early signals, downloads, or social media attraction or whatever. And we kind of try to technically track a bioarchive and Mac archive before to find for us interesting papers and then decide what we can do with it. And I see two major points on preprints. One is you have a real breakthrough, then you better be prepared when it will end up in a preprint or will be picked up anyhow. Or you have a really bad preprint, which will create a lot of public attention. And then it's very important to think about what you can do about, because it's getting splashed around. And we had a few of these preprints who were pretty bad science and were nevertheless promoted by whatever. And therefore, science didn't think enough before that, okay, it's nice to communicate fast who's first and then get the peer review certification later. But for the public, it's different. So you will not have the luxury to just ignore a preprint as a news journalist. And science journalism has to completely reorganize in how to do it in the future, I guess. And I still think this will remain the case. But I have not a simple answer to how should we proceed from here. So what we do now is we kind of have a typology of preprints and only a certain section of it we are interested in. For example, a preprint which is pretty bad, but has a high social media attraction. We will kind of look at whether we can do something to help journalists not covering this or cover it in a critical way or whatever. That could be one strategy. And we have a little product where we just send to the journalists, well, this is a bad preprint, maybe here's a comment on it and you should not report about it. That's just experimental. And then we have these real breakthroughs, or the breakthroughs who are given. For example, Elon Musk had this preprint, which was a bad one, about a new technique of implanting brain-computer interfaces to pigs. And this was a bad one and had a huge attraction. It was just a PR stunt, basically. And we did critical expert comments on that one because we thought, well, it will be covered and we better hurry up. But for the real breakthroughs, I would wait and maybe solicit some expert comments and then wait before it's either published in a peer-reviewed journal, or if it's then picked up by some press outlet, but then we are prepared. But in the pandemic, all these rules went over the rule. So I agree with Fiona. We had to do stuff on preprints, and there were very influential ones and also some good ones where we had to react, and we did, and we tried to do. So basically, but what are the formal rules for the future? For me, that's not yet clear.
It's interesting, and Fiona, you mentioned, I think it was you, we're having to react really fast because there's no embargo with preprints, and it's all right there. And I think that brings an interesting point in as well, which is about embargoes and what happened to them over the last 18 months. For the first part of the pandemic, we just completely got rid of them for COVID content, because we were moving so fast, it was virtually impossible to even think about it. The normal way it will work is our embargo period actually fits quite nicely in with the production process, whereby we have a period where we have that paper before it goes live. We can't get it live any sooner, so that's a good period for the journalists to work with. But obviously, when you're throwing everything at it, as it were, these windows became very tiny for COVID content, such that it eventually, we early on decided just no embargoes. We just get the information out there as fast as we can. And my team, which was swamped and is small, was basically just focused on getting the press releases written and making sure they were extremely sound, so they were still getting subbed by the professional sub-editors that work on the papers themselves, and just getting that out there. But we did notice that the coverage dropped as a result, and we also noticed various other organizations around us were still embargoing stuff. So what was your experience with the embargo process? And perhaps Volker, will start with you. Did you still see it continue? Did you like it? Did your journalists want it? Where did it go in Germany?
Yeah, I think, as I said, besides the pandemic, I think less papers are kind of picked up. If you do it quantitatively, I would say all non-pandemic science reporting really went down, I would say. I mean, if you count the news articles on, let's say, embargoed science articles, my prediction would be it went down quite a lot last year, just empirically. I mean, and that was just information overload, I guess. You couldn't just work on all these other stories because they had to work on COVID. Therefore, it's interesting how it will change again after the pandemic. Will it come back to the pre-level, or will it be transformed to a new level? Because as you know, there were always critics of the embargo system. I always defended it. I think it's still a sensible thing to do. But with preprints, it's becoming more difficult. And yeah, and on the other hand, for the pandemic stuff, almost all the papers I have seen who later were published in peer-reviewed journals were first in preprint. I cannot remember of a lot of papers who were not preprinted, major breakthroughs or very important results who were not preprinted before republished in major scientific journals. I have no quantitative data, but my gut feeling would be not many.
We've done some initial analysis which actually suggests that for COVID content, and we're talking about our entire cohort of COVID, so across the 3,000-ish journals that we've got, that actually the minority of research went on a preprint first, which I was very surprised about, because we were proactively encouraging scientists to post it on the basis of, you know, moving the science forward, and also the misconception some scientists have that they can't preprint work that they're publishing. So I was quite surprised to see that.
But also the ones in the high impact region. So if you
that's a good question. I think we haven't disaggregated the data enough to see that. I do know of high impact stuff that did not hit preprints first, and of course, you know, you have to remember this is the scientist's decision. It's not anyone else's decision what they want to do with their papers. But it was definitely by no means everything hit preprints first. I was really quite surprised by that, Volker. So Fiona, did you want to come in on preprints a bit more?
So on embargo, so I think,
I'm sorry, embargoes. We've moved.
Sure who the audience is today, but I think maybe some basic principles bear re-emphasizing here. So the way I see this is there is the scientific process here, where the scientists do their science and now they put it on preprints and they thresh it out, and that's amazing. And then there is something distinct, and that's what us three are in. So move along that from the scientific process and the creation of data and the checking and verifying of data to the bit of this where the science gets to the public. And as Volker said, you don't get chance to do that many times. I mean, yeah, in some cases you will, but generally a set of findings hit the public attention once. And I think this is what we care about. And it's very important not to, because I have had scientists challenging me, saying you're against preprints. And I think, Alice, your reminder there that Nature are very for them is very good. We're very for them. I think they improve science, and we care about good quality science, and anything that can improve good quality science is great for us. But we're not engaged in that. I'm not a trained scientist. I am a trained press officer. And what we have here are some things, including this thing called the embargo, that makes that good quality. The communication of those scientific findings to the public, it makes that better quality. And I think that's what we're talking about here. And preprints getting out, 3 seconds after they've been posted on a server to the wider public, making claims that aren't yet verified and corrected, is not best for the public. Now, in a pandemic, you have to do that. Jeremy Farrar, and many others criticised in Ebola and SARS and all these, like, what ethically, morally, it is untenable to wait 2 months for publication of findings that can feed into policy and other scientists that are tackling these diseases. But ethically, I would say we now have to, and Volker says, I don't know what is the future. I don't know what is the future, but the embargo worked. It was imperfect, but it allowed the journalists to read the whole paper. They had time, maybe only a day or two, but 2 days for journalists. They can read the whole paper. That will make for better reporting. They can contact the SMC and say, can we have some third-party comments? Because I can't work out whether this is a really good paper that cures cancer or just a small contribution. We get 10 third-party comments say this is just a small contribution, or this is very significant, put it on the front page. That helps for better reporting. So I am still, I'm afraid, of the view that the system that we're involved in, for all its perfections, was working well and in the public interest. And so I think we all struggled with it in preprint, the speed and the lack of embargoes. We did actually, my colleague Tom actually did a little survey of journalists about a year in to say, do you all not want embargoed stuff anymore? And actually we were amazed. The science and health news journalists were saying, no, we like embargoes. And they too, just exactly the same way that we were overwhelmed, they were overwhelmed. And if they could have had literally even a few hours to look at that study, to tell their news desk and to work out, to look at our third-party comments and work out how prominent this should be and how they should report it, they would have been grateful for that. So I think now, one of the things this whole discussion is making me think is we need some kind of inquiry into the science communication. I'm worried that the official inquiries in all of our countries will be all about blame game, and they'll all be about, when we went into lockdown and why we didn't go in sooner. And that's very important. But I just wonder whether we need some kind of global inquiry into science communication which could unpick this, because I actually don't want to hear people now. I've had in the last week, I've had a couple of emails from science press officers about papers on embryology saying it's a preprint, can you help us? Well, no, there's no urgency, there's no public interest in speed print on embryology. It's fantastic, it's a preprint. It will be all the better when it's published for that. And the other thing I think, Alice, that you've mentioned to me before, but we haven't talked about here, is scientist expectations. We've got scientists who come into the SMC, please do a briefing on our preprint, on COVID research, which we have done lots of. We need to get this into the public domain now. We need policymakers to look at our evidence on transmission in schools before they decide about closing schools. All great. And then 3 weeks later, they come and say, Nature has accepted it, do us a big fancy press conference. This is a Nature paper on transmission in schools. And I have to turn around and say, well, 3 weeks ago, it was all over the media. So you're not going to get that kind of coverage. So scientists' expectations as well, they want it out at preprint stage, and then they want another bite of the cherry a month later when it's a published paper, and they're not going to get that.
I think that's a really good point, because when we're assessing what we will press release, what we're going to promote, obviously all the papers in our high profile journals go out to the journalists anyway, but if something has been promoted at preprint stage and has a lot of coverage, there is literally no point in us promoting it again. So we just don't, because we have so much volume now that we can't. So I think that's something, that's an awareness shift. And we're also seeing a lot of questions about, can I preprint my molecular physics paper? And the answer is, well, you can, but that is contrary to our guidelines, and we don't really see the point in that. But just to unpick back, because I think this is important to the questions that we're asking here about how science communication is changing as a result of the pandemic. best practice has always been you want an embargo window of, more than 2 working days, ideally, 4 or 5 working days. That I think is changing. I think that expectation has changed as a result of this, such that now when we're dealing with COVID content where we can, because of how things are moving, unless we're trying to kind of build all our processes much earlier and monitor them and minutize such that we can do maybe a 24-hour or even 48-hour embargo window for this stuff. And I think it's really helping with the journalists. And I think where some of them at the start, we had people saying journalists saying it's an outrage to embargo anything to do with COVID. They're now moving to oh, thank God I've got an embargo situation. So I think we're seeing a change, but I think in the future, what we're going to see is a slightly different attitude to embargoes, where they will probably be a bit shorter than they were in the past. Would you agree, Volker?
Yeah, I think that that will be, in some cases it will create problems, but in others not. I wanted to comment on one issue about the preprints without the embargo, and that is also for the journals something changed, because if a scientist, of course, first publishes a paper on a preprint, you can look whether you wanted to have it in Nature, and you couldn't do that before. Before you had to wait that somebody's sending you a manuscript, and now you can also look in preprints wherever there are lots of. So that is basically also a good thing for the editors of the scientific journals to pick the best stuff and then get a good peer review and get quality science in good journals. And that's one. But the other thing is, and science is not really looking into this. There are many guys out there who really write bad papers in preprint because they want to have public attention, and they are not doing science in any way. I mean, you had all this hydrochloroquine stuff and all these crazy studies, and lots of people push now because it's looking like science, and then I can publish a preprint, and it will never reach any respected journal, but it will still damage public health in certain ways. And the preprint servers have also to think about this problem. I don't know the solution again, but I mean, this is the problem. The people tricking the system, saying, I have a preprint, but it's just rubbish. Okay, you and me as scientists can disentangle this, but some people out there cannot. And we have no solution to that problem.
I think that's a really good point, Volker. I mean, some of the preprints are actually doing a very good vetting job, as I understand it, but it's patchy, as with everything, but also as with publishing. Let's not forget that we have actually had some challenging papers that have ended up being published in various journals from various publishers. Now, we've got some really brilliant questions come through, so rather than me continuing to steer, I'm gonna read some of these because I think they're great. So the first one we've got is, do you feel that scientists have become more easily available during the pandemic and more open and talkative than previously? And I'm interested in your perspective on this, but I'm also going to jump in just to talk a little bit about a piece of work that Nature, the journalists at Nature did with actually with the science media centres around the world, feeding from an initial survey that was done at the Oz SMC, which was looking at the impact of speaking publicly around COVID-19 and the various elements of the pandemic, the impact that had on scientists in terms of the levels of harassment they were facing. And this survey, we surveyed scientists around the world and found that I think it was something like 15% of scientists had received death threats as a result of their media engagement, 22% receiving threats of physical or sexual violence, and that 40% had been affected emotionally or psychologically by speaking out and engaging. And I think that's a really important question, because how is this going to change how willing scientists are going to be to engage with the public, to inform public opinion on important scientific issues of the day? But also equally back to the original point, are scientists more game for doing this? Are they retreating what we're seeing? So Fiona, can I start with you?
Yeah, a really good question, and something that I'm fascinated by now in terms of whether or not it will continue. So I would say yes, 100%. It's been phenomenal, the amount of scientists that have made themselves available to the media and have been seen by the public. It's just not possible to be a member of the public and not see tens and hundreds of scientists on your TV screens, in your newspapers. That's why we exist, to encourage more scientists to engage in the big stories of the day. So we absolutely loved that. I would say another distinction, I remember when we set up 20 years ago, one of the things I was really shocked by was that this thing called science communication with the media was done by kind of enthusiasts, so people who ran science festivals at universities, and one of them who ran the Cheltenham Science Festival admitted that when he applied to be head of department, he didn't put in that he ran the Cheltenham Science Festival, because everybody said you won't get the job as head of department if you talk about your science communication. It was frowned on by the senior important scientists running labs as kind of frivolous. That has been changing for 20 years. That has been changing, but I really felt it in COVID. It was the senior, very, very good scientists. It was Sarah Gilbert herself who discovered the Oxford vaccine, who did the media, and Andy Pollard and others with her. It was Peter Horby and Martin Landry who ran recovery testing antivirals to see whether, drugs to see whether they worked. They were doing the media repeatedly, knowing, and there was a closer connection than I've ever felt between scientists doing the science to help this pandemic and recognizing that doing science communication was also essential to battling the pandemic. And that's the bit, I don't know what Volker and you think of that, Alice, that's the bit that I don't know if we can bottle and recreate in future, this very close connection between if we don't do media, or if we leave it to people who don't know much about it, we will not actually get through this crisis. And I can think of other major stories we've had, like Fukushima or volcanic ash or Novichok or whatever, where I don't think the same argument we couldn't use that same argument to persuade scientists to speak out. So it will just be so interesting to see whether these scientists stay in the media and something has fundamentally changed, that they feel it is their responsibility, or whether they, as you say, Alice, retreat. And you're absolutely right to point out that not all of them have enjoyed themselves. It's been very difficult. Volker, in his first comment, talked about even then, back in January and February, scientists were retreating, not just because of harassment actually, but because of the politicization, and scientists were doing SMC briefings and making very mild, measured, sciencey points, and 2 hours later it was front page news and politicians were forced to comment on it. So just the kind of the center stage nature of what these scientists were saying was terrifying to many of them.
Yeah, from a German perspective, I completely agree with many of your points, and maybe I see there were kind of three phases. So in the first phase, scientists were really opening up. They were talking to us, to science journalists, a lot, and willing to go on TV because they felt this need to do this very complex communication situation, because everybody was affected, and they went out. That was the first phase. That was good. So it was a good place to be. Then we had these politicized debates. How dangerous will this be? And are all the experts heard? And are there other experts who have also need to be heard? And then science became aware that there is a difference between science journalism and general journalism, which is a very important one. And so in Germany, at least, science journalism in the first two phases had very, very high credibility, but basically became later politicized because basically we had some kind of good policy in Germany in the beginning of the pandemic. And so science journalists were not against these policies because they were sensible. And we had low caseloads in the beginning. And then later on in this third phase, many people felt, well, not all the experts are being heard. And from my perspective and our science media perspective, and even from very major scientists, well, some of these guys who came up late, they should better not be in the public domain, because they were not the best of the scientists doing lots of the really original science, but just commenting on other people's science and having different opinions about it, and politicized opinions, and were critical of the government or whatever. And so therefore in the third phase, and that is why we lost last autumn and maybe this time again, there were all these people, well, we have it's behind, and we don't have to worry anymore. And these kind of experts were coming up and coming forward. And now we have a big fight between political journalists and science journalists, whether we kind of not have the full spectrum of expertise but focused on certain expertise in epidemiology, modeling, virology, but not educational experts and whatever behavioral scientists and people who had different opinions about stuff. And there were big fights now, and still there are, who should report about these kind of issues and which kind of experts the public really needs. And I still, as a science media center, say, well, we always need the best experts, domain-specific experts who can talk about what they are really doing, and not just guys sitting in a retirement and commenting on the politics of the day. I mean, this is just different. So, and therefore I see there were different phases. And I fear now that in the third phase, many eminent scientists kind of retreated a little bit because they were kind of fed up. I want to do my research again. Like Christian Drosten is a famous example. I mean, he's fed up with all these debates. He wants to do his research again because he's a researcher and he doesn't want to be a public communication figure. And he did this podcast not because he wanted to be a communicator, but because he felt the need that this needs to be communicated because it's a big issue. And he was right. I mean, this is just, but he will retreat from the public because he don't want to be a public science communicator in the future. He wants to be a researcher, and that's good. I mean, we need these kind of researchers. And therefore the science media model, I think, is still brilliant because we only talk to these guys when there is a public interest and public need to talk to these guys, and not every day. I mean, we are not harassing them every day if a SARS-CoV-2 expert is not virologist is not needed. So
this brings really nicely into a question which I think is mostly for you, Volker, but Fiona, I know you're going to have opinions on this one as well, which is how do you make sure that you do not get lost in the political quarrels between the different views of scientists, and what path, I guess, do you think you should steer there? And the example they've given is the Drosten versus Streeck debates in Germany. So Volker, perhaps you'd like to talk to that.
Yeah, that is, of course, the most contentious debate in Germany. We had two famous virologists, or more or less famous, one very famous and one less so, but still a virologist. He's the director of the Institute of Virology in Bonn, and he's an HIV expert, and that is already one difference for me. So we had Christian Drosten as a SARS-CoV expert, and we had other virologists who were also kind of capable of talking about general virology issues. But if you wanted to talk about original research with COVID and SARS, that was the difference already. And then the communication behavior of these scientists were different because both of them had a completely different view of how the pandemic would work out. And Streeck was basically against major measures, and Drosten was right to say we need more strong measures. And therefore we had these big public debates. And the interesting thing is, if you would count the articles where science journalists quoted or reported on Hendrik Streeck, you will find almost none. And that is already telling you something. So I had stories from regional journalists phoning us and saying, my chief editor wants to have an interview with people opposed to the measures being oppressed on the population because they are too strong, and we need a critical virologist who is against these kind of measures. And because some people are canceling subscriptions in our newspaper, which I felt was quite a statement, but this happened. So, and therefore, I think as the Science Media Center, yeah, we came out trying to argue where you can see differences in the expertise and domain-specific expertise of certain scientists, and we aim to find the best scientists in a certain domain of research, and not any scientist. That is just our policy. It depends, of course, on the question, but the more you go to the core of the scientific question, the better the experts have to be who comment on that issue. I still think there is no other way of doing it. Therefore, I think although this gatekeeping is criticized on many fronts, I still think gatekeeping is necessary and in the public interest. Yes, it is. As a journalist, as a scientist, as a journal, and also as a science media center. It's not just the diversity of opinion which we put on the public to say, well, this is 100 experts saying different things, and now make up your mind. I don't agree on this.
So I think that's great, Volker. I mean, from the perspective of the journals, I guess the point is we really don't step into political quarrels. We're all about publishing the scientific research. If it cuts it with peer review, that's the point that it goes through. And I think that's something that's been lost a little bit, where we've been accused of not publishing X or Y paper for political reasons. And I go back to the same point again and again, which is it doesn't matter what the politics are, it matters what the science is. And if the science is robust and significant, that's when it's going to get into the journal, and it's got nothing to do with politics. It could be completely unpalatable, it could challenge all our fundamental beliefs. If the science is robust, that's when you're going to see it in the journal. And I think stepping away from politics is where we are. It's just not about politics. Fiona, your thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with what you just said. That's the approach that we champion, but I would say there would be disagreement within the scientific community. I want to say to scientists, please resist politics. You know, I was once asked during the pandemic to sit on a panel saying, well, you know, what in a country of armchair epidemiologists, and when the newspapers are full of, you know, columnists and opinion articles about the pandemic, what role for scientists? And for me, the worst possible role is for the scientists to become pundits and write op-eds. You know, it is to resist politics, do good science, as Volker says, do the good science, don't just talk about it, explain that science and call out the bad science, and just resist politics. It's not easy, but you have to decide, do you want to try to resist it, or do you embrace it? And I think there are lots of scientists who have felt that the right thing to do during the pandemic was to accept that it was political and advocate particular policies and condemn government when they didn't implement them. And I think that's dangerous. And actually the principles that you've just articulated, Alice, that nature go by, I think will serve science well in the long run, because it works either way. You're not publishing the good studies because they're politically convenient, and you're not publishing bad studies for political convenience. Politics doesn't enter into either of those. And that's what's good about it. I know Fred Sawyer, who I think has been really interesting in this, a journalist who does some of the science for Unheard. He wrote an article saying scientists have become celebrities, they've enjoyed the media spotlight, good for them, let them stay there, but they have to understand that, like celebrities and like politicians, they will be open to the same kind of questioning and scrutiny. I've liked some of his journalism in that, but I utterly disagreed with that article. I don't think they should be, as Volker said, celebrities or politicians. I do think they should go back now. You know, the worst case scenario is that great scientists who work on, you know, extremely sciencey aspects of this stay in doing programs like Political Question Time and giving us their view about the war in Afghanistan. I just don't want to see that. So it's a debate that needs to happen, I think, but certainly, if I'm honest, the SMC favours openly, and the science and health journalists know we do, those very, very good scientists who tend to stick to the science when they do media. And then what we can have then is we can have a public debate and a media informed by good science, and then they can have those debates. Do we go into lockdown or don't we? Do we close schools or not? But if the scientists are arriving at those debates as politicians, I don't think that helps.
And maybe I add one thing, and that was kind of confused with some of the scientists speaking in the public domain, either through science media centers or on their own voice, and at the same time advising government in committees. And then if you are in a committee to, of course, make a recommendation for a certain policy based on a certain scientific results you have, that's fine. But if you then at the same time go out to the public and criticize, for example, somebody who didn't do what you recommended in your subcommittee, I mean, this creates problems. And I think scientists should be clear about what they are. Are they advisors of the government in a scientific committee? That's fine. Then there are advisors, or am I speaking in a public role as a scientist doing a piece of and having an expertise? I think some people mess this up sometimes. And I agree with Fiona. I mean, scientists should stick to the evidence they can have and they see and they published and they can comment on. And these policy advisors are a different thing. Of course, we need policy advice in politics from scientists, of course. but you cannot have both. I think we have to think about what scientists should do and should not do, and we have these kind of politics turned scientists running around and behaving like scientists, but are in fact politicians. And I don't like that. This is not the way to go, I would argue. And we have to find these independent experts who are willing to speak out on issues if they are controversial or political, not nice. And we have to find these people and we fight for them. But it's getting difficult, of course. If everybody is in a committee advising government, because this is such an extreme situation. So what do you do? I mean, this is really a problem. And at certain times we had that problem. Because the experts are not we have not millions of them.
These are brilliant. I'm aware we have 4 minutes to go, and I've got 3 more questions. The first one I'm going to read, but I think we've really spoken to it, which is the past years heightened the debate. Is neutrality the right route forward, or is it the obligation of scientific organisations to take a stance against conspiracy theories and harmful rhetoric? What are your thoughts on this clear break from the past and a definite step towards a more politically engaged future? And I think we've spoken to this, and we're basically saying stick to the science. Now, I think there is an important point here, which is on conspiracy theories as opposed to differences of opinion here. And what I would say is I think we need to be very careful about the terminology conspiracy theory. Differences of opinion are one thing, and I think conspiracy theory got used a lot as a term, and we need to be careful with that. But broadly speaking, the recommendation here around science communication is really look to where the science is as opposed to where the fringes are. But moving on from that, the next question is, do you ban journalists from your press briefings who repeatedly or intentionally disseminate fake news? Fiona, your thoughts?
No, but we haven't had any who've done this. So our press, this again is contentious in some circles, our press conferences, and I said we've done 200 on COVID, are only open to science, health, medical journalists. We've always had that, and as you know, in the UK there were daily press conferences from Downing Street with the Prime Minister and chief scientific advisors, and they had political journalists and other journalists. We didn't have them, and we, you know, one of the several of the worst days of the pandemic for me were when we it was a particularly topical issue and political journalists were screaming down the phone at us saying, why am I not allowed to come to this briefing? Because your news outlet is covered very well by the 3 science and medical correspondents attending from your news outlet. And this is a science briefing. So we stuck firm to that. And I, you know, before we finish in our 2 minutes, can I just do a massive shout out for specialist journalists? Not general news, not political editors, but science, health and environment people who did an absolutely brilliant job, who always said in their articles, this is a preprint, therefore it's preliminary research, and we worked with them, and I think that worked well. So luckily we haven't had to, but just bear in mind that we are about the public. You know, I think we've said that lots of times in this. So we could ban a paper because a journalist has been badly behaved, but then the science would not get through to the readers of that newspaper. So I don't want to be banning journalists, even if they're annoying. We'll take it up with them, we'll challenge them, we'll argue with them. In the past, we've been to see editors about particular journalists, but we're not going to ban a news outlet from SMC briefings because those news outlets have public readers and viewers.
I'm going to jump in quickly and say we don't ban anyone, but they have to have credentials and show that they are science reporters who have reported and provide us with clippings. I do think their point here is that science reporters and other specialists hopefully will have a bigger role in the future in the newsrooms. I'd like to see that, and I think that's a change that we will see from a science communication perspective. Volker, the last minute is yours.
Yeah, I would say no, we don't ban journalists, and we actually made some effort to reach certain important non-specialist journalists, and also trying to get some information to them in press briefings or in talking to them and helping them in their reporting. We found that quite important. I mean, of course, we have the major focus on science and health correspondence, but also with regional journalists or the ones in major schools. They had a lot of questions, and we try to have, first of all, relationship to them, talk to them, and to help them doing a better job or connecting them to scientists. And I think that was a good thing to do. But in normal, I would agree that we fight for better science journalism and good health quality journalism. And science has to understand that you need this critical journalists to have an informed public. If you don't have good journalism, science will lose out in all these social media debates. Science will not succeed. You need journalists and good journalists
Volker,
to cover.
I agree. Good journalists are the heart of it all. Thank you so much, Volker, Fiona. You've been an absolutely brilliant pair of panelists. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.